The morning Augusta Holloway rode into Colton Creek, New Mexico territory, the year being 1883, she arrived with nothing but a carpet bag, a bruised jaw that had yellowed at the edges, and a reputation that had traveled faster than any horse could carry it. She did not know the reputation had arrived before her. She did not know that Mabel Prout had written her sister in Colton Creek 3 weeks prior, detailing every ugly syllable of what had happened back in Abilene. She did not know that when she tied her borrowed horse to the post outside the general store and pushed open the door with its small brass bell, every woman inside already knew her name and had already decided what kind of woman she was. What Augusta knew was that she was 22 years old, that she had exactly $4.60 in her coat pocket, and that she needed work. She had been traveling for 11 days. She had slept in a livery stable outside of Santa Rosa because the boarding house would not take her, and she had eaten hardtack and dry jerky for the better part of a week. Her dark hair was pinned up but badly so, with strands escaping in every direction, and her green eyes, sharp and watchful as a hawk's, scanned the store with the practiced alertness of someone who had learned that danger often came wearing a friendly face. The woman behind the counter, stout and silver-haired, looked at Augusta the way one looks at something unpleasant tracked in on a boot heel. "Help you," she said, and the words were technically helpful but the tone was not. "I am looking for work," Augusta said. Her voice was clear and unhesitating. She had decided some miles back that she would not apologize for arriving. Any kind of honest work, cooking, cleaning, mending. "I can keep accounts if someone needs them kept. I have a good hand and I am strong." The silver-haired woman, who Augusta would later learn was called Edna Marsh, looked her over slowly. The 2 other women in the store, examining bolts of calico near the window, had gone very still in the particular way of people who are listening hard while pretending not to. "You are Augusta Holloway," Edna said. It was not a question. Augusta did not flinch. "I am. I heard about you." Edna's mouth pressed into a thin line. "From Abilene." "I expect you did." Augusta held the woman's gaze. "What you heard and what is true are likely 2 different animals, but I will not stand here and argue the point. I am asking for work, not absolution." The silence in the store was thick enough to cut. One of the women by the calico let out a small disapproving sound, barely audible. "I cannot help you," Edna said. "I would suggest you try further down the road." Augusta nodded once, picked up her carpetbag, and walked back out into the October sunlight. She stood on the wooden sidewalk for a moment, her jaw set, looking up and down the main street of Colton Creek. It was a town of perhaps 300 people, she estimated, a livery, a saloon, a small church painted white, a sheriff's office with a man sleeping in a chair outside it, his hat tipped over his face, a barber shop, a milliner's, and at the far end, a land office with a hand-painted sign. She was trying to work out her next move when she heard the sound of a wagon coming fast down the main street, the horses blowing hard, the driver pulling them up short outside the general store with a clatter of iron-shod hooves on the packed dirt. The man who climbed down from the wagon seat was tall, broad through the shoulders, wearing a worn brown duster and a hat that had seen considerable weather. He moved with the unhurried efficiency of someone accustomed to covering distance. He had dark brown hair curling slightly at the collar and jaw stubble that was a day or 2 past what you would call deliberate. Augusta guessed him to be somewhere around 28 or 30. He had the kind of face that was not immediately striking, but the more you looked at it, the more you saw strong lines, a mouth that seemed to be in the habit of thinking before speaking, and eyes that were an unusual shade, somewhere between brown and amber, that caught the light in a way that made them hard to look away from. He glanced at her as he came up onto the sidewalk, the way one person acknowledges another person's existence, and then he stopped. "Excuse me," he said. His voice was unhurried, low, and pleasant. "Are you new to town? You look like you might be working out a problem." Augusta looked at him squarely. She had learned to gauge men quickly, and she had learned that the ones who seemed friendly were sometimes the most dangerous of all. but there was nothing in this man's face that set off the old alarm in her chest. He looked, she decided, like a man who asked questions because he was genuinely curious about the answers. "I am looking for work," she said. "It appears the town has had advance notice of my arrival and formed a view." Something shifted in his expression, not pity, which would have made her want to walk away immediately, but something more like recognition, as if he understood the mechanics of small-town opinion and found them tiresome. "What kind of work?" he asked. "Any honest kind." He nodded slowly, pushed back his hat, and studied her in a way that was not rude but was thorough. "I am Monroe Langston. I run the Langston Ranch, about 4 miles northeast of here. I have been without a cook and housekeeper for 6 weeks since Mrs. Adler's daughter took sick in Tucson and she went to tend her. I have 4 ranch hands and a younger brother who eat like they are in competition with one another, and the bunkhouse smells like the inside of a boot. If you can cook and clean and keep some order, I can pay you $12 a month and give you a room of your own in the main house." Augusta studied him right back. "You do not know me," she said. "No," he agreed. "I know you are standing outside Edna Marsh's store looking like someone who has been on the road a long time and does not intend to be beaten by it. That tells me something useful. People in this town have a particular opinion of me," she said. She was not going to hide it. She never hid difficult things. Hiding difficult things had a way of making them worse. Monroe looked at her steadily. "People in this town have a particular opinion of a great many things," he said. "Some of those opinions are correct and some are not. I tend to form my own." He paused. "The offer is genuine. I need help and it sounds like you need work. If you want to ride out and see the place before you decide, I'm making a supply run and will be heading back in about an hour." Augusta looked down the main street of Colton Creek one more time, at the church and the saloon and the sleeping sheriff and all the tidy, closed doors, and she looked back at Monroe Langston. "I will take the work," she said, "and I will not wait an hour. I can sit in the wagon while you make your supply run." The corner of his mouth lifted, just barely. "All right then," he said. The Langston Ranch was beautiful in the particular way that New Mexico Territory was beautiful, which was to say it was vast and spare, and filled with a light that was not like light anywhere else in the country, golden and slanted in the afternoons, turning the red rock ridges along the eastern boundary of the property into something that looked biblical. There were cottonwoods along the creek that ran through the lower pasture, and they had gone yellow with the season, and the horses in the north paddock moved like slow water through the amber grass. Augusta sat beside Monroe on the wagon seat and did not speak much, and neither did he, which she found comfortable rather than uncomfortable. Most people, she had learned, filled silence because they were afraid of what it might reveal. Monroe Langston seemed like a man who did not fear his own quiet. When they came over the last rise and the ranch house came into view, she felt something she had not felt in a very long time, which was the tentative, fragile beginning of the sense that a place might be all right. The house was low and long, built of adobe and timber, with a wide porch running the full length of the front. The barn was red and well-maintained. The fence lines were straight and the yard was swept. "It is a good ranch," she said. "It is a lot of work," he replied, and the way he said it made clear that he meant this as a compliment to the place, not a complaint. She met the ranch hands that evening. There were 4 of them, as Monroe had said. Hector, who was Mexican and had been with the Langston family since before Monroe's father died, and who had a dignity about him that made Augusta instinctively respectful. Caleb, who was 19 and had the loud, enthusiastic energy of a young man who had not yet been told no in any meaningful way by life. Dutch, who was compact and quiet and watched everything with close eyes. And Patrick, who was Irish-born, red-haired, and possessed of a cheerful sarcasm that Augusta found, despite herself, funny. And there was Monroe's brother, who was introduced to her as Will, and who was 26 and had Monroe's same dark hair but a quicker smile and an easier manner, and who shook her hand with both of his, and said he was profoundly glad to meet her, because he had eaten Monroe's cooking for 6 weeks and was beginning to believe he might not survive a seventh. Augusta cooked supper that first night from what she found in the kitchen, which was not much, but she made a beef stew with cornbread from the supplies Monroe had just purchased, and when she set it on the table, the men went quiet in the way that people go quiet in the presence of something that exceeds expectation. "Lord in heaven," Patrick said after the first spoonful. "She is an angel sent directly from God." "She is a woman who knows how to cook," Monroe said, but he said it in the tone of someone who means the same thing. Augusta ate at the far end of the table and listened to them talk, and she kept her face pleasant and neutral, and she thought about how long she might be able to stay in a place before the news from Abilene found its way to the Langston ranch. The answer, it turned out, was 8 days. Those 8 days were good days. She established a routine quickly, because routine was the thing she did best, the architecture of order over chaos. She was up before dawn every morning, getting the fire going in the big kitchen stove, starting coffee, mixing biscuits. She cleaned the house from one end to the other with a systematic thoroughness that made it look, as Patrick observed, like a different building. She mended a great mountain of shirts and work pants that had been accumulating in a basket beside the hearth. She organized the pantry and made a list of what was needed. Monroe, she noticed, was always the last one in at night and the first one out in the morning, and he ran the ranch with a quiet competence that she found herself watching with something like admiration. He was fair to his men in a way that was not soft. He expected work and he did his share of it, more than his share actually, and there was nothing he asked of his hands that he would not do himself, which she could see earned him something more valuable than obedience. It earned him loyalty. He was also courteous to her in a way that was not performative. He did not make a show of respecting her. He simply did it naturally, as if it had not occurred to him to do otherwise. On the 4th day she was there. She was hanging washing on the line in the side yard when she heard hoofbeats and turned to see a woman riding up on a gray horse. The woman was perhaps 45, well-dressed in a dark riding habit, her posture the precise, deliberate posture of someone making a statement. She had the kind of face that might have been beautiful once, and now wore its opinions too openly for beauty to survive. This was, Augusta would learn, Vera Holcomb, who owned the neighboring property to the east and who had, apparently, been a close friend of Monroe's mother, and who regarded the Langston ranch with a proprietary interest that had no legal standing but a great deal of social weight. Vera looked at Augusta over the gray horse's ears with the particular expression of a woman who has already finished a conversation in her head and arrived at the part where she wins. "You must be the new help," she said. She said the word help the way one might say the word infestation. "I am Augusta Holloway," Augusta said. "Good morning." Vera's eyes narrowed very slightly. "I know who you are," she said. "I had a letter from my cousin in Abilene last week." Augusta put down the shirt she was holding and looked up at the woman on the horse without any change in her expression. "I hope your cousin is well," she said. Vera's horse shifted and she controlled it with a small, precise movement of her wrist. "I think you should know," she said, "that Monroe Langston is a respected man in this county. He has a reputation to consider. The people of Colton Creek look up to him. And whatever happened to you in Abilene, whatever choices you made, I made no choices," Augusta said. Her voice was very even. "But I do not expect that information to be useful to you, since the story you have heard is already arranged to your satisfaction." Vera stared at her. "You are impertinent," she said. "I am honest," Augusta replied. "If those seem like the same thing to you, I imagine that says more about the conversations you are accustomed to than about me." Vera turned her horse and rode back the way she had come, her spine a perfect rigid line. Augusta picked up the shirt again and finished hanging the washing and did not let herself shake until she was back inside the kitchen with the door closed behind her. The story from Abilene was this. Augusta had been employed as a bookkeeper for a merchant named Gerald Prine. a man of 51 who was married and church-going, and who sat on the town council. Gerald Prine had decided that Augusta, who had come to Abilene from her father's dead farm with nothing but her education and her willingness to work, was his to take what he liked from. When Augusta had refused him, he had told his wife that Augusta had made advances toward him. His wife, a woman named Harriet who had weathered 20 years of Gerald Prine's particular character and had developed strategies for surviving it, had chosen to believe her husband's version because the alternative was too large to face. Harriet Prine had told her friends had told their husbands had told the town council. The town council had sent 2 men to Augusta's boarding house to tell her that her presence in Abilene was no longer welcome. The bruise on Augusta's jaw had come from Gerald Prine on the day she refused him, when he had demonstrated that he was not accustomed to refusal. She had not told anyone about the bruise because she had already understood by then that no one would believe her. She had been called ruined by everyone who knew her story. Ruined as if she were a piece of cloth that had been torn, something that had once had value but was now fit only for the rag heap. Ruined as if what Gerald Prine had tried to take from her, and she had refused to give, had diminished her anyway by the mere fact of his attempt. She had been called that word in Abilene, and she had been called it by implication in Santa Rosa, and she had seen it in Edna Marsh's eyes in Colton Creek's general store. And she had carried it with her the way you carry something heavy, not because you accept that it is yours to carry, but because there is nowhere to put it down. Monroe came in for supper on the evening of the 8th day quieter than usual. The other men ate and talked, Patrick telling a long meandering story about a horse he had once known in County Cork that had an inexplicable hatred of hats, and Caleb laughing too hard at all the wrong moments, and Will interjecting with a dry precision that made Dutch snort into his coffee. Augusta moved between the kitchen and the table and kept her face the way she had learned to keep it, smooth and present and unrevealing. After the meal, when the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and Will had gone to his room, Monroe sat at the kitchen table while Augusta washed the dishes, and he did not immediately say what he had to say. She could feel him working up to it. The silence had a different quality than their usual easy silence. This one had weight. "Vera Holcomb came to speak to me today," he said at last. Augusta did not stop washing. "She came to speak to me as well," she said, 8 days ago at the washing line. Monroe was quiet for a moment. "She told me," he said carefully, "a story about your time in Abilene." "I expect she did." Augusta set a pan on the drain board and picked up another. "And I expect the story she told you is the one Gerald Prine and his wife invented because the truth was inconvenient to them." She heard him shift in his chair. "I would like to hear what happened," he said, "if you are willing to tell me. But I want to be clear that you do not owe me an explanation. You have worked honestly on this ranch for 8 days, and nothing about that work changes regardless of what happened in Abilene." Augusta stopped washing. She stood for a moment with her hands still in the water and looked out the dark window above the basin, at the reflection of the lamp in her own face, and then she turned around and dried her hands on her apron and looked at Monroe Langston. She told him. She told him all of it, plainly and in order, without embellishment and without minimizing, and she watched his face while she told it. His expression did not change in any dramatic way. He listened with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, fully and without interruption. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet for a long moment. "Gerald Prine is a coward," Monroe said. His voice was level, but there was something under it, a controlled heat like iron that has been in the fire and has not yet shown it outwardly but is storing the temperature inside. "And the people of Abilene failed you." "Yes," Augusta said simply. "They did." He looked at her across the kitchen table. "That word people use," he said. "Ruined." He shook his head. "That word has no place on this ranch. I want you to hear that clearly. Not as something I am saying to be decent, but as something I mean. What Gerald Prine did does not define you. It defines him. And the story Vera Holcomb and everyone else in Colton Creek is currently passing around is not your story. It is a lie built by a man who needed one. Augusta felt something happen in her chest that she was not entirely prepared for. It was not that she had not known these things herself. She had known them. She had held on to them in the dark of the livery stable in Santa Rosa, and the long hours on the road, and the cold mornings before the ranch came to life. And she had told herself the same words in her own head many times. But there is a difference between knowing a thing yourself and hearing it said aloud by another person with conviction and without agenda. That difference is substantial. It is the difference between surviving and beginning to actually breathe again. She sat down at the kitchen table across from him. "Thank you," she said. "I do not know what Vera Holcomb intends to do with what she knows." Vera Holcomb intends to have an opinion about everything that occurs within 30 miles of her property line, Monroe said with a dry precision that was so much like his brother's that Augusta almost smiled. "She will talk, because that is what she does. I cannot stop that. But what happens on this ranch is my concern, and what I think of the people who work here is my own judgment to make, not hers." Augusta nodded. There was a quality to the moment that felt both simple and very significant, and neither of them tried to turn it into more than it was. They sat at the kitchen table for a few more minutes, finishing their coffee, and the conversation moved to smaller things, the state of the north fence line, the mare who was close to foaling, whether the first real cold was coming early this year. And Augusta felt the tight coil inside her chest ease, just a fraction, just enough to notice. She was still there 3 weeks later, and then 6 weeks after that. October moved into November and the first hard frost came, and Augusta made apple butter from the last of the season's fruit and put up preserves in the cellar and switched the household over to winter routines with the efficiency that she had come to regard as her great talent, the ability to see what needed doing and do it without requiring anyone to ask twice. She and Monroe fell into a rhythm that was comfortable and peculiar, and gradually became something she recognized as the best kind of friendship. The kind built not from liking the same things, but from respecting the way the other person moved through the world. They talked in the mornings, when the ranch was quiet and the coffee was hot, about everything and nothing. She had grown up in Missouri, on a small farm that had failed by degrees in the years after the war, and he had grown up here, on this land his father had broken and built and left to him, and they had both come to their situations through roads that were harder than the ones they had expected. They understood each other in that particular way. Will noticed everything, being the kind of person who watched the people around him, the way Monroe watched the land, with constant quiet attention and the ability to read what was not being said. "You like her," he said to Monroe one evening when they were checking the fence line in the far north pasture, the two of them riding side by side in the cold blue dusk. "She is a good person to have on the ranch," Monroe said. "That is not what I said," Will replied. Monroe was quiet for a moment, which was his version of admission. "She has enough to manage without me making it more complicated," Monroe said at last. "More complicated how?" Will asked. "She is not a child. She is a grown woman who has managed more than most people twice her age. I think you underestimate her." "I do not underestimate her," Monroe said. "I am trying not to be another man who decides that what he wants is more important than what she needs." Will looked at him for a moment. "That is a noble way of keeping yourself lonely," he said, and then he clicked to his horse and rode ahead and left Monroe alone with the thought. Augusta, for her part, had not allowed herself to think about Monroe in any way that was not strictly practical. She had learned in a very direct way the cost of vulnerability, and she had put that cost in her accounts and made note of it, and decided that the ledger did not currently support any new entries in that column. She was grateful to him. She respected him. She found him, increasingly, the person she most wanted to talk to at the end of a day. But she had also found Gerald Prine initially decent, and she had learned from that error. So she kept herself careful, and she watched Monroe Langston from the careful distance she had constructed, and she noticed things she would not let herself name. She noticed that when he came in from a hard day's work and sat down at the table and she put a plate in front of him, he always said thank you and he always meant it, and there was nothing performative about his courtesy. It was simply who he was. She noticed that he remembered small things she had mentioned in passing, that she had loved the cottonwood trees for their color, that she had once wanted to learn to play the piano but had never been able to afford lessons, that she preferred her coffee strong and had no patience for it weak. She noticed that he stood between her and Vera Holcomb's opinions in a way that was not protective in the patronizing sense. He did not fight her battles for her or speak for her, but he made clear through the simple, consistent weight of his regard that she was valued here, and her presence was not a subject of debate. The crisis, when it came, arrived in the form of a man on a bay horse on a Tuesday morning in the first week of December. Augusta was in the yard splitting kindling when she heard the horse and looked up and felt the cold go from outside her to inside her in the span of a single breath. The man on the horse was not Gerald Prine. He was a man she did not know, perhaps 35, wearing a coat that had been good once and now carried the general air of a long journey. He had pale eyes and a mouth set in the permanently aggrieved expression of a man who spent a great deal of time writing letters to newspapers about things that offended him. "Looking for Monroe Langston," he said. "He is in the barn," Augusta said. Her voice was steady. The man's pale eyes moved over her with the particular inventory of someone who has been given a description and is matching it. "You would be Augusta Holloway," he said. "I would," she said. "Name's Ira Prine," the man said. "Gerald Prine's brother." The hatchet was in her hand and she was aware of it. She set it down carefully against the wood pile. "What is your business here?" she said. "My brother wants it known that he has engaged a lawyer in Abilene," Ira Prine said. He said it with the satisfaction of someone delivering what they believe to be a killing blow. "He intends to pursue a formal complaint regarding defamatory statements made about his character. He has been told that you have been repeating your version of events to persons in this county." Augusta stood very still. "I have not defamed anyone," she said. "I have told the truth when asked to tell it, which I believe is my right as a living person." "Gerald Prine is a respectable man," Ira said. "A church-going man. A man of community standing." "Gerald Prine struck me and then lied about the reason I left his employment," Augusta said. Her voice was very clear and absolutely without tremor. "If he wishes to pursue a lawyer, that is between him and his conscience, assuming he can find it." "I would advise you to be very careful," Ira Prine said. "And I would advise you to carry that message back to your brother," said Monroe Langston's voice behind her. She had not heard him come out of the barn. He came to stand beside her, not in front of her but beside her, and he looked at Ira Prine on his horse with an expression that was entirely composed and utterly unyielding. "Ira," he said, because apparently everyone in 4 counties knew each other in this part of New Mexico territory, "you have ridden 4 miles onto my land to deliver a threat to a woman in my employ. I am going to ask you to leave now." "Monroe," Ira said, with the tone of a man deploying a weapon he has been saving, "you know her history. You know what kind of woman she is. I would think you would want to protect your reputation." "My reputation," Monroe said, "rests on how I treat people, not on how easily I believe gossip about them. Augusta Holloway is an honest woman who was wronged by your brother, and everyone who has eyes to see and ears to hear knows it, whether they choose to say so or not. Your brother is not going to pursue any lawyer because what he would have to say under oath would do him considerable more damage than his current story. You know this. That is why you rode out here personally rather than sending an actual lawyer." Ira Prine's pale eyes went flat and cold. "Leave my land," Monroe said. "Do not come back." There was a long moment in which Ira Prine sat on his horse and looked at Monroe Langston and apparently took a private accounting of the situation and found the numbers against him. He turned his horse without another word and rode back the way he had come. Augusta stood in the cold yard and watched him go. Her heart was moving at a pace that was not entirely comfortable. "He will tell his brother," she said when the horse was out of earshot. "Yes," Monroe agreed. "And his brother will decide whether it is worth the expense and humiliation of actually pursuing this in court, where the truth has a way of being more complicated to manage." He looked at her. "Are you all right?" "I am," she said. And then, because she believed in honesty, "I am angry mostly. The particular anger of having to keep defending my own account of what happened to me." "I know," Monroe said quietly. He paused and then said, "You should not have to keep doing that alone." She looked at him and found something in his expression that she had not let herself see clearly before, because she had been carefully not looking. There was something there that was not simply the regard of an employer for an employee or even a friend for a friend. There was something more than that, something that had been building for weeks in the early mornings with coffee and the long evenings on the porch and every conversation they had ever had about everything and nothing, and it was patient and careful as he was, but it was unmistakably there. "Monroe," she said, and then she did not immediately know what to follow it with. "You do not have to say anything," he said. "I am not pressing you for anything. I just want you to know that I am here, whatever that is worth to you." She stood in the cold December morning looking at this man who had given her a room and a fair wage, and 12 weeks of being treated as if she were precisely as valuable as she actually was. And she thought about what her life had been before the Langston ranch, and she thought about what her life was now, and she thought about the dangerous, tender thing that had been growing in her chest all this time that she had been carefully not naming. "It is worth a great deal," she said. The weeks leading up to Christmas were busy with the kind of busyness that Augusta welcomed, because it gave her something to do with all the feelings she was not yet sure what to do with. She baked in a fury of productivity, turning out pies and bread and spice cakes and a sugar-glazed ham, and the ranch house smelled so magnificent that even Dutch, who rarely showed enthusiasm for anything, came to stand in the kitchen doorway and breathe the air with visible appreciation. She and Monroe walked out to the east pasture one afternoon to look at a section of fence that needed repair, and the day was cold and very clear, the sky a deep saturated blue above the red and ochre of the landscape, and the cottonwoods along the creek had dropped their leaves now and stood silver and bare, and the whole world looked like something that had been carefully drawn in clean lines. "My father planted those trees," Monroe said, nodding at the cottonwoods. "He said a ranch was not a ranch without something that changed with the seasons, something to mark the time." "He was right," Augusta said. She could feel the cold in her cheeks and the warmth of him walking close beside her, the occasional brush of his arm against hers. "I never had much of a home," she said. "Not in the way you did, not with something planted and growing and marking time." He looked at her. "Is this feeling like home?" he asked. There was something careful in the question, an awareness that he was asking about more than the ranch. She looked at the silver cottonwoods and the red rock ridges in the distance and the straight fence lines of the Langston land, and she looked at him. "Yes," she said. His hand found hers where it hung at her side. His fingers were warm despite the cold, work-rough and careful, and they closed around her hand slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she needed to. She did not pull away. They stood like that for a moment, looking out at the land, hands together, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing that needed to be said just then. It was Will who precipitated the next step, as Will had a talent for precipitating things. He waited until Christmas Eve, when the 5 ranch hands had gone into town for the celebration at the saloon, and the house was quiet and warm, and he appeared in the doorway of the sitting room where Monroe was reading and Augusta was mending one of Hector's shirts, and he looked at the two of them with the expression of a man who has reached the limit of his patience with a situation. "I would like to say something," Will announced. Monroe lowered his book. Augusta looked up from the mending. "The two of you," Will said, with the precision of someone who has rehearsed this, "are making me absolutely exhausted. You look at each other when the other one is not looking, as if you are studying something you cannot afford to want. And when you talk to each other, you have the air of people who are saying one thing and meaning another, and hoping the other person understands the translation. And I have been watching this for 2 months, and I am going to say plainly what you are both clearly not going to say, which is that you are in love with each other, and it would be beneficial to everyone, including me and my nerves, if you would acknowledge this and act accordingly. He then turned and went to his room and closed the door. There was a very long silence in the sitting room. Augusta set down the mending. Monroe set down the book. They looked at each other across the small, warm room, and the fire crackled between them, and outside the wind was coming off the mountains with the high, lonesome note it had in winter. "He is not entirely wrong," Monroe said, with a careful neutrality that was entirely inadequate to the moment, and that he seemed to recognize, because he stopped and then said something different. "I am in love with you, Augusta. I have been since about the 3rd week you were here, when you argued with me about the feed account for 20 minutes and were completely correct and never once said so directly. Just let the evidence make the case for you. I did not say anything because I did not want you to feel that you owed me anything for the work or the roof, or that I was another man trying to press a claim on you that you had not invited, but Will is right that it has become somewhat difficult to manage." Augusta looked at him for a long moment. The fire spoke quietly in the grate. Outside, the wind. "I have been afraid," she said, "because the last time I trusted a man in authority over me, it cost me everything I had built. And I know you are not that man. I have known that almost from the start. But knowing something and letting yourself believe it are two different things, and I have been working at the believing part." He nodded. He crossed the room and sat beside her on the small settee, turning to face her, and he was close enough that she could see the amber in his eyes catching the firelight. "I am in love with you too," she said quietly. "That is the honest truth of it, and I am terrified of it, and I am grateful for it, and I think I have been for quite some time." Monroe put his hand against her cheek, very gently, and she let him, and she turned her face slightly into the warmth of his palm. He kissed her with the same quality he brought to everything, careful and unhurried and entirely sincere, and she kissed him back with all the feeling she had been carefully not naming, and it turned out that naming it was nothing to be afraid of. It turned out that it felt like the cottonwoods in October, like something marking time, something rooted and changing and exactly right. They told Will the next morning, on Christmas Day, and his expression was one of such profound relief that Patrick, who had come in from the bunkhouse to find Will looking beatific over his coffee, spent the better part of the morning trying to work out what had happened. The thing about small towns, Augusta had learned, was that they ran on information the way engines ran on coal, and the news that Monroe Langston was courting the woman about whom Vera Holcomb had been circulating opinion was, in the economy of Colton Creek, a significant development. Vera herself appeared at the ranch on a Monday in late December, this time riding with purpose, and this time Monroe was in the yard when she arrived, and Augusta stood on the porch with her arms folded and her chin level. "Monroe," Vera said, pulling up her gray horse, "I am concerned." "That is kind of you," Monroe said, with a courtesy that was technically genuine. "This woman's history is her own business," Monroe said, "and I know it better than you do. More importantly, I know the truth of it, which is different from the version you have been carrying." Vera looked at Augusta on the porch with the expression of a woman who is accustomed to having the last word and sees it receding. "The community will have a view," Vera said. "Communities often do," Monroe said. "I have found that the communities that spend the most time having views about other people's choices generally have a fair amount of their own material to work with. I do not say this to be unkind." "Gerald Prine is a respected man," Vera said, for what Augusta supposed was the last available iteration of this argument. "Gerald Prine hit a woman who refused him and then lied about it to save himself," Monroe said. "I have Augusta's account of what happened, and I have seen no evidence that contradicts it and considerable evidence that confirms it, including the fact that his own brother rode out here to make threats rather than sending a proper lawyer, which is what an innocent man with a legitimate complaint does. He looked at Vera steadily. Augusta Holloway is an honest, capable, extraordinary woman, and she is going to have a place on this ranch for as long as she wants one. I hope you will come to feel that is something worth knowing rather than something worth arguing against. Vera sat on her horse for a long moment, and something in her face shifted, very slightly, and Augusta could not quite read what it was. Then she turned her horse and rode away, and this time there was something less rigid about her spine. 2 days after the new year of 1884, Monroe asked Augusta to walk with him to the cottonwoods by the creek, which she did, in the cold, clear afternoon light that she had come to love the way she had not known she was capable of loving a landscape. They stood among the silver winter trees, and Monroe turned to her and took both her hands, and his face had the look of a man who has thought about what he is going to say for some time and has arrived at the simplest version of it. "I want to marry you," he said. "Not because I feel that I have an obligation to or because of what anyone else thinks or says, but because you are the person I want to spend my time with, every morning and every evening and every afternoon in between. You are the most honest person I have ever known and the most capable, and the person whose company makes me more myself rather than less. I want to build something with you. On this land in this house with whatever time we are given." Augusta looked at him, at the face she had come to know so thoroughly and yet still found new things in, and she felt the thing that was not fear and was not grief and was not the careful protective distance she had been carrying for so long, but something that was simply joy, plain and complete and trustworthy as the winter light. "Yes," she said, "that is my answer. Yes." He smiled, and it was a full smile. One of the ones she had learned were rare and worth everything, and he pulled her in and held her against his chest among the bare cottonwoods with the cold coming off the mountains and the creek running soft under its skin of ice, and she put her arms around him and held on. They were married in March, when the first green was coming back into the land, and the cottonwoods were beginning to show the faint gold green of new leaves. The ceremony was performed by the minister from the Colton Creek church, a quiet man named Reverend Thomas, who had been told the full story by Monroe in a private conversation some weeks prior, and had subsequently told his congregation, with the authority of the pulpit, that a person's virtue was not measured by what others had done to them, and that the people of this community would do well to examine the standard they applied to women who had survived difficult circumstances. It was not a large wedding. Will stood beside Monroe, looking genuinely moved in a way he would deny if anyone mentioned it. Hector brought his wife, Maria, a warm and magnificent woman who had known Monroe since boyhood and who embraced Augusta that morning with the warmth of someone officially claiming her as family. Patrick wore his best coat, which was somewhat less best than he believed it to be. Dutch appeared in a clean shirt and nodded at Augusta with the solemn approval of a man who has decided she merited it. Caleb cried, which surprised everyone, and denied it vigorously. Vera Holcomb came as well, which surprised Augusta. She sat in the back of the small church, and she did not make any public statement, but after the ceremony in the yard outside, she found Augusta and stopped in front of her. "I owe you an apology," Vera said. There was something in her face that looked like it had cost her. Augusta looked at her steadily. "I believed what I was told without examining it," Vera said, "because it was convenient to do so, and because," she paused, and something older and more complicated moved through her expression. "I have my own reasons for wanting to believe that a woman's troubles are always partly of her own making. Those are my reasons, and they are not yours to bear." She paused again. "I am sorry for the harm I did you." Augusta considered this woman for a moment, the rigid posture and the careful face, and the effort that this small speech had clearly required. "Thank you," she said. "It was not forgiveness exactly, but it was the beginning of a door that was not entirely closed. I appreciate you saying it." Vera nodded precisely and moved away, and Augusta turned back to the yard full of people she had come to know as her own, and Monroe found her through the crowd and took her hand, and she leaned into his shoulder briefly, quickly, in the way that is almost invisible and means everything. The spring after the wedding was a busy one. There were always 1,000 things to be done on a working cattle ranch when the season turned: fencing and branding and moving cattle to summer pasture. And Monroe worked from before dawn until after dark for weeks at a stretch. And Augusta worked alongside him in all the ways that she could, managing the house and the accounts, and increasingly finding herself drawn out to the work of the ranch itself, which Monroe encouraged without any particular ceremony, simply pointing things out and explaining them and handing her the relevant tools when she asked for them. She learned to ride properly on a solid bay gelding Monroe bought her in April, and Hector taught her with a patience and good humor that she found one of the great gifts of her new life. And within a few weeks she was competent, and within a few months she was good, and within a year she could keep pace with Monroe and will across open country and still have horse left at the end of it. She also took over the accounts of the ranch formally, because Monroe had been keeping them in a system of his own that was functional but inefficient, and within a month she had reorganized them into something so clear and useful that Monroe looked at the ledger, and then looked at her with an expression that combined admiration and mild embarrassment at his own previous system. "Do not say anything," he said. "I have not said a word," she replied, with the expression of someone saying volumes. In the summer of 1884, something happened that Augusta had not quite allowed herself to hope for. The editor of the Colton Creek Gazette, a man named Silas Porter, who was approximately 70 years old and had seen enough of human nature to be difficult to shock, published a small editorial in which he observed that the women of the territory deserved the same presumption of honesty extended to men when it came to allegations of misconduct, and that the habit of communities protecting powerful men by sacrificing the reputations of women of limited means was both a moral failure and a practical one. He did not name Gerald Prine or Augusta. He did not need to. Everyone in the county knew what he was referring to. The editorial was not a revolution. The editorial was a single paragraph in a small paper, but it was said publicly in print with the Gazette's authority behind it, and Augusta read it twice, sitting at the kitchen table in the early morning light, and felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for a very long time. She showed it to Monroe when he came in for breakfast. He read it and looked at her. "Silas Porter is a good man," he said. "He is," she agreed. And then she set the paper down and made his coffee, and the morning proceeded, and the sun came up over the red rock ridges, and the horses moved in the north pasture, and the ranch ran on as it always did, solid and real and hers. The winter of 1884 into 1885 brought the news that Gerald Prine's business in Abilene had failed. She heard this from Will, who heard it from a man passing through, and she sat with that information for a while, and found that what she felt about it was less than she might have expected. Not satisfaction, particularly, and not grief. Something more like the feeling of a chapter in a book that has been closed without ceremony, simply turned past because the story has moved on. Gerald Prine's lawyer had never materialized. She had half expected another visit from Ira, but none had come. The threat had been exactly what Monroe had said it was, a performance by a man whose confidence in his own position was beginning to erode. In January of 1885, Augusta told Monroe that she was pregnant. She told him in the kitchen after supper, when the house was quiet and the fire was burning low, and she had been carrying the knowledge for 2 weeks and turning it over in her mind with something between wonder and terror. Monroe went very still when she told him, and then his face did something she had only seen it do 2 or 3 times before, which was become entirely unguarded, every careful habitual composure simply falling away, and what was underneath it was a joy so complete and unperformed that she felt it in her own chest like a bell ring. He crossed the kitchen and took her face in both his hands and looked at her with that open face and said, "Augusta," and the way he said it with everything he meant by it made her eyes go hot. "Are you all right?" he asked. "How are you feeling? How long have you known?" 2 weeks, she said. "I am feeling fine." A little nauseous in the mornings, but nothing I cannot manage. And yes, I am all right. I am more than all right. She smiled at him properly, fully, with all of it. I am quite extraordinarily all right. He held her for a long time in the kitchen with the fire going low and outside the January dark and the cold coming off the mountains, and she could hear his heart beating, steady and certain as the ranch itself. Will's reaction the following morning, when Monroe told him over breakfast, was to cheer so loudly that Dutch dropped his coffee cup. Patrick began to sing, which was generally his response to any significant event. Hector came in from the yard, heard the news, and clasped Monroe's hand, and then turned to Augusta and bowed his head with a formality that was also somehow warm, and said that this was a great blessing. And then Maria, when she heard from Hector, arrived with a pot of postle and a collection of opinions about what Augusta should and should not be doing. And Augusta received all of this with the bewildered gratitude of someone who has spent a long time traveling alone and has arrived somewhere that has a lot of people in it, and is only now understanding that this is what she had been missing. I pulled Augusta aside later that afternoon, ostensibly to ask her something about the supply list, and then stood there not asking about the supply list for a moment. "You know Monroe," he said. "He was alone for a long time after my father died. He built this place and kept it going and looked after me and the hands and was responsible for all of it, and he never complained and he never asked for anything for himself. And I used to worry about him, that he would just keep going that way. Useful and capable and completely alone." He stopped. "I just wanted to say, you have made him very happy, the kind of happy that is not just good feeling but something more settled. Like he can breathe in a way he could not before." Augusta looked at Will, this young man who loved his brother the way that quiet people love things, deeply and without many words for it. "He has done the same for me," she said, in case that was not apparent. Will smiled, and it was a smile so much like Monroe's, that rare full one, that she felt a rush of affection for him that was entirely its own thing, the particular love that comes from a brother-in-law who saw what was true and was glad to be right about it. The baby came in September, a boy, born in the early morning when the light through the bedroom window was the color of the inside of a peach, and Monroe sat beside the bed and held Augusta's hand the entire time. And the doctor, who had ridden out from Colton Creek the previous evening when Hector went to fetch him, later told his wife that he had never seen a husband hold still so well under the circumstances, which he meant as the highest compliment. They named the boy James Hector Langston. James for Monroe's father, Hector for the man who had known the ranch before Monroe had. When Augusta told Hector, standing in the yard on the second day after the birth, the old man's face did something that she had not seen it do before, which was become momentarily young. "That is a great honor," he said very quietly. "It is the truth," Augusta told him. "This ranch could not have been what it is without you. Our son should carry that." Hector nodded and looked at the mountains for a moment and then back at her, and what was in his eyes was something beyond thanks. The first years of James's life were the years during which the Langston Ranch grew into the thing it had been working toward being. Monroe expanded the herd and improved the pasture rotation, and negotiated a reliable contract with the railroad line that was pushing through the territory. And Augusta managed the household and the accounts and an increasing share of the business correspondence, because she had a clear, precise, persuasive way with written language that Monroe admired deeply and had learned to rely on. She also rode out regularly, not just for pleasure but for the work of the ranch, understanding the land and its rhythms in the way that you can only understand them if you are actually out in them. And Monroe had long since stopped thinking of the ranch as a thing that had a natural boundary at the front door of the house. James learned to walk and then to run, and then to climb things that he absolutely should not have been climbing, and he had Monroe's eyes, that amber brown that caught the light unexpectedly, and Augusta's hair, dark and determined, and a character that was entirely his own, which was to say he was forthright and observant and had strong opinions about horses, which he expressed loudly from the age at which he had words to express opinions with. Caleb, who by this point was 22, and had grown from a loud, enthusiastic boy into a loud, enthusiastic young man, became James's dedicated admirer and unofficial second uncle, carrying him on his shoulders across the yard and teaching him the names of the horses and singing him songs of questionable suitability that Augusta periodically had to intercept. Patrick returned to Ireland in 1886, having saved enough money to buy back a small piece of land near the place he had grown up, and the day he rode out of the Langston ranch for the last time he shook Monroe's hand, and then, with great ceremony, picked up Augusta and carried her around the yard twice, and she laughed hard enough that she could not speak for several minutes. Dutch replaced him as head hand when Hector's knees got bad enough that he moved to lighter duties, and Caleb hired on 2 young men from town, and the bunkhouse dynamic changed, but the essential character of the place did not. In 1887, Will married a woman named Clara from Santa Fe, who was a schoolteacher and approximately as different from Will in temperament as it was possible to be, being lively and decisive where he was quiet and oblique, and who therefore suited him perfectly. She and Augusta became close with the particular efficiency of women who recognize each other across a room. Clara started a school in the community that met 3 times a week, and Augusta helped her organize it and sometimes taught when Clara was unavailable, and the school grew into something permanent within 2 years. The year 1888 brought a second child to the Langston house, a girl this time, and they named her Ruth for Augusta's mother, who had died when Augusta was 12, and about whom she had spoken to Monroe in the long evenings with the kind of detail and love that told you the person doing the telling had been keeping these stories safe for a long time, waiting for someone worthy to give them to. Ruth was small and dark-haired and fierce, and from her first weeks of life, it was apparent that she intended to have views about everything, which she would have been allowed to do regardless, but which Monroe regarded with an entirely unconcealed pride. Augusta turned 29 that year, and Monroe turned 31, and they sat on the porch in the evenings when the children were in bed, and the ranch was quiet, and the sky over the territory was enormous and full of stars, and sometimes they talked, and sometimes they simply sat together in the particular companionable silence that is its own kind of conversation. One evening in October, when the cottonwoods were yellow again, and the air had that first edge of winter in it, Augusta looked out at the land and thought about the morning she had ridden into Colton Creek with $4.60 and a bruised jaw and a reputation that had gotten there before her. She thought about Edna Marsh's face and Vera Holcomb on the gray horse, and the long cold road from Abilene and the livery stable in Santa Rosa. She thought about standing on the wooden sidewalk working out her next move, and the wagon that had come fast down the main street with a man on the seat who had stopped and asked her what she was working on and then made a plain, sensible offer of work. "What are you thinking about?" Monroe asked. He was watching her with the steady attention that she had never lost the appreciation for. "The morning I rode in," she said. "How different everything might have been." Monroe reached over and took her hand on the porch railing where it rested. "You would have been all right," he said. "Whatever happened, you are the most formidable person I have ever known." "I know I would have survived," she said. "I have always been good at surviving. That is a different thing from this." She looked at the yellow cottonwoods and the mountains and the horses in the pasture and felt the lamplight from inside the house warm on her back and heard, faintly, the sound of James talking in his sleep 2 rooms away. "This is not surviving," she said. "This is living." Monroe brought her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips to her knuckles in a gesture that was quiet and absolute, and she turned her face toward him and he turned toward her, and they sat in the October evening together with everything they had built between them and around them and ahead of them still to come. The following spring, in 1889, Colton Creek got its first properly organized women's social and literary circle, which had been Clara's idea and Augusta's organizational energy behind it, and which met in the schoolhouse twice a month, and which became, over the years that followed, a genuine force in the community, advocating for practical matters like clean water, and for larger ones involving the treatment of the women who came through the territory in circumstances not unlike Augusta's own. Augusta spoke plainly at these meetings. She had never been a woman who softened necessary things, and she was not about to start, and her clarity gave other women permission for their own, which was itself a kind of work she had not known she would do, but which came to feel as important as any other. Edna Marsh joined the circle in its second year, which surprised people and surprised no one. She and Augusta were never friends exactly, but they came to a practical mutual respect that was its own kind of resolution. Edna made a donation to the schoolhouse roof fund the year it needed replacing, and she did it without announcement, and Augusta accepted it without ceremony, and neither of them made more of it than it was, which was perhaps the most genuine thing about it. Vera Holcomb died in 1890, of a fever that came quickly and left no room for argument, which people who knew her said was the only kind of ending she would have accepted on principle. She left a bequest to the school that surprised everyone considerably, and that Clara spent on reading primers and slates, and a proper wood stove that kept the building warm all the way through the coldest days of winter. At the reading of the will, the lawyer found a private letter addressed to Augusta. It said, in Vera Holcomb's cramped, precise handwriting, "I was wrong about you, and I knew it before I said so. The truth is I was wrong about a great many women over many years, and I have not always corrected it. I am correcting it where I can. Do not waste the school or the children in it. You are better than I gave you credit for being, and I was not as bad as you perhaps thought. Yours, Vera Holcomb." Augusta kept the letter in the tin box where she kept the things that mattered. It sat there with her marriage certificate, and the deed to the section of land Monroe had put in both their names the year after they married, and the letter her father had sent her from Missouri, the year she left it, which she had read until the creases had become threadbare. James Langston grew up to be a boy who loved the land with the same instinctive bone-deep love his father had for it, and who also had his mother's way with numbers and language, and who at 12 was already more useful on the ranch than most grown men. He was not without his difficulties, being forthright in the way that Augusta was forthright, which meant that he occasionally said things that needed to be said, but at moments when more diplomatic timing would have served better, and Monroe would take him out to check the fence line, and they would come back with whatever it was settled between them, and Augusta would look at the two of them and feel something that there was not a precise word for, but which was in the general region of rightness. Ruth, at 10, had decided that she wanted to be a doctor. She announced this at the supper table with the complete assurance of someone who has examined the landscape of available options and made a considered professional decision. Monroe looked at her for a moment and said, "All right then. You will need Latin and mathematics." Augusta added reading in French, which she had learned from a missionary woman she had met once who had impressed upon her the importance of French medical texts. Ruth accepted these requirements as reasonable, and proceeded to work on them with a determination that made Caleb, who was still on the ranch and now foreman, shake his head in admiration whenever he saw her at the kitchen table with her books. The territory of New Mexico was working toward statehood in these years, and the conversations about land rights and community governance and legal protections were ones that Monroe engaged with seriously, sitting on the county committee that was helping to shape the structures that would eventually govern the state. Augusta sat beside him at the public meetings, not as a silent adjunct but as a participant, and her voice in those conversations carried the weight that it had earned over the years she had spent building something real in the territory. Hector retired formally from ranch work in 1891, his knees having made the decision for him, and he and Maria moved to a small house that Monroe built for them on the southern edge of the property. because neither Hector nor Monroe had any intention of calling the relationship between them anything so limited as employment. He spent his days in the garden Maria had created around the house, and in the evenings he came to the main house for supper more often than not, and James and Ruth sat on either side of him at the table and listened to his stories with the absolute attention that good stories commanded. In 1892, Augusta turned 31 and Monroe turned 33, and they had been married for 8 years, and the ranch was thriving and the children were growing, and the cottonwoods along the creek were in their autumn gold for the 9th time since the morning they had stood among them, and Monroe had taken her hand, and the winter had been about to begin. She came out to the yard one October afternoon to find Monroe standing at the fence looking at the cottonwoods, his hat in his hand, his face turned toward the yellow trees. She came to stand beside him the way she had stood beside him 1,000 times, close enough that their arms touched. "I was thinking," he said without turning because he had heard her as he always heard her, "about the first morning you were here. When I drove back from the supply run and you were taking it all in from the wagon seat, you had this expression." "What kind of expression?" she asked. "Like a person standing in a doorway deciding whether to come in," he said. "Wanting to come in but not yet ready to trust the floor." She considered this. "That is not inaccurate," she said. "I wanted to tell you that day that it was solid," he said, "that the floor would hold, but it was too early. I had not earned the right to say it yet." "You earned it," she said. He turned and looked at her, this man she knew so thoroughly and still found worth looking at, and his face had the quality it always had in these moments, fully present and fully his. "I know I did," he said, and there was nothing arrogant about it, only the straightforward acknowledgement of a thing they had both built together with intention and care. "And so did you." She looked at the yellow cottonwoods. "They are better every year," she said. "Everything is better every year," he said, and he put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and the October light lay golden and warm across the Langston land, and the horses moved in the pasture, and the creek ran clear under the yellow trees, and from inside the house came the sound of Ruth arguing with James about something mathematical that would be resolved before supper and forgotten by morning. And from the direction of the barn came the sound of Caleb singing the unsuitable Irish song that Patrick had taught him before he went back to County Cork. And the mountains were blue against the sky, and the land went on in every direction as far as you could see. In the evenings when the children were older, and the house was full of the specific rich noise of a family that had things to say to each other, Augusta would sometimes stand in the kitchen doorway and look at the table, at Monroe and James and Ruth and Will and Clara when they came to dinner, and sometimes their 2 boys as well. And she would hold the moment in her mind the way you hold something irreplaceable, carefully, and with your full attention, because she had known what the other thing was, and this was not it. And she was not in the habit of forgetting. There had been a morning when she had ridden into a town that did not want her, carrying a word that other people had put on her like a brand, that word ruined, as if she were property that had been damaged and was therefore without worth or future or the right to love and be loved in return. She had carried that word for a long time, and she had carried it alone, and it had been heavy, as lies are heavy, as injustice is heavy, as the sustained effort of refusing to become the thing other people say you are is heavy. And then a man on a wagon had stopped and asked her what she was working on, and the answer had been everything, and he had made a simple offer and she had taken it, and everything after that was the life she was standing in now, real and warm and full and entirely hers. Monroe came to stand behind her in the kitchen doorway, his hands on her shoulders, looking at the table the same way she was looking at it. "What are you thinking?" he asked softly, as he had asked her 100 times on the porch in the evenings. She turned and looked at him. "That I am glad I rode in," she said. He smiled, the full one, the real one, and said, "So am I every single day." She put her hand against his face the way he had put his hand against hers on that December evening long ago, careful and certain, and he turned his face slightly into her palm, And then Ruth called from the table that supper was getting cold. And James said it was Ruth's fault for talking so much. And Monroe lifted an eyebrow, and Augusta shook her head, and they went back to the table, back to the noise and the warmth and the ordinary magnificent fact of their life. And the lamp burned bright against the New Mexico dark, and the cottonwoods outside were silver in the autumn, and the ranch went on around them, steady and real and breathing, exactly as a good thing should. The year James turned 16, he asked Monroe to formally teach him the business side of the ranch alongside the physical work, and Monroe brought Augusta into those lessons as his equal partner in the instruction, which was how James Langston grew up understanding that a ranch was built by two people together, and that the accounts and the livestock and the land were all one thing, and that the person who understood numbers was not a secondary figure but a fundamental one. He grew up understanding this the way he understood that the cottonwoods marked time, and that the mountains did not move, and that his parents, after all these years, still looked at each other with the specific attention of people who know exactly what they have and intend to keep it. Ruth left for medical school in 1898, which required correspondence and advocacy, and a great deal of Monroe's time writing to people in official positions, and a great deal of Augusta's time writing letters that were more persuasive than Monroe's, because she had a particular talent for making an argument feel inevitable. When Ruth boarded the train in Colton Creek with her trunk and her medical texts and her absolute self-possession, the whole family stood on the platform, and Hector and Maria were there, and Caleb was there, and Clara's two boys, who had grown up thinking of Ruth as a figure of admiration and mild terror, and the train pulled out of the station, and Ruth leaned out the window and waved. And Augusta kept her face steady right up until the train was out of sight and then let Monroe put his arm around her and leaned into his shoulder. "She is going to be extraordinary," he said. "I know," Augusta said. She did know. She had always known it. "That is not why I am crying." "I know," he said gently. James stayed. James was always going to stay, not because he did not have choices, but because the land was in him the same way it was in Monroe, bone-deep and permanent. He would inherit the Langston Ranch, and he would run it well, and he would carry the name forward, and the cottonwoods along the creek would be there for him to plant things beside and to mark time with, and that was its own kind of continuation. On a September evening in 1899, Monroe and Augusta sat on the porch as they had sat on it for 15 years of evenings, and the territory was still 2 years from becoming a state, but the conversations were happening, and the country was turning a page, and the century itself was about to end, and the porch was the same, and the mountains were the same, and the sound of the ranch settling into night was the same as it had always been. Augusta was 40 years old. Monroe was 42. They had gray at the edges now, both of them, and the years had put their mark on them the way years put their mark on good things, with depth rather than diminishment. "I got a letter from Ruth," Augusta said. She had been saving it for the evening. Monroe turned toward her. "She has been offered a position at a hospital in Santa Fe," Augusta said. "Permanent. They want her to head a ward." Monroe was quiet for a moment, and then he smiled, and it was the fullest one, the rare one, and she loved him for it the way she had loved him for everything. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. The stars came out over the territory. One and then another, and then all of them at once the way they always did. The same stars that had been there on the night she had ridden into Colton Creek with nothing but her carpetbag and her $4.60. And the name people had given her without her consent. The same stars that had been there when Monroe Langston had stood beside her and said that word has no place on this ranch. The same stars that had watched all of it, the fear and the courage and the long, slow work of building trust, and the precise moment of naming love and the children and the seasons and all the years of mornings. And they were indifferent to all of it, as stars are. But they were also beautiful, and the night was clear, and the porch was warm. And beside her sat the man she had chosen and who had chosen her back. And the ranch breathed around them in the dark. And there was nothing left unfinished. nothing left to fear. Nothing left that was not exactly and completely what she had dared to want. She reached over and took his hand where it rested on the railing, and he turned his palm up and held hers, and they sat together in the last year of the century, in the territory that was becoming a state, on the land they had built together. And the cottonwoods were silver in the dark below the yellow flare of the stars. And the creek ran on, and the horses breathed in the pasture, and the long road from Abilene was so far behind her now that it was only a story she could choose to tell or not to tell. A thing that had happened to a woman who had refused to be broken by it, and had ridden forward into the rest of her life. And the rest of her life, it turned out, was this.